because you first governed when you were born, so everything you understand about the world is deeply embedded in your brain from that experience. And there are two distinct moral systems functioning in society today, pretty much worldwide, that is conservative and progressive. And I just want to underscore that we're not talking about political systems. We're not talking about the partisan definition of conservative and progressive. We're talking about a moral systems, and we'll get to that. As I mentioned, avoid frequently made messaging mistakes. And then, very critically, how to change the frame of critical issues, which can help us change public discourse to forward more progressive ideas. So if you take a look at each of those pictures there, they will evoke an idea of what you believe as progressives. And what's important about that is that each of those policies are based on a moral system. And that moral system is unconscious. It is unconscious physically in your brain. And what we've started learning is that your unconscious changes what you understand about the world before it becomes conscious to fit your set system that you are operating in. And what we need to do is start making that conscious in order to communicate effectively. And that every issue that you can possibly imagine is linked to a unified moral framing, and that needs to be communicated repeatedly to be effective. So today we'll begin learning how to think and communicate our moral system effectively and repeatedly. And one of the results will be to unify across issues, as opposed to what I and many people call issue silos that exist right now, where you have environment advocates use a different message and have a different language than people in progressive economics or labor or education. Everybody has all these different messages and language that they speak, and it creates issue silos. And one of the takeaways that I want you to come away with is why current methods are ineffective. We, as progressives, tend to rely very heavily on science, and this is science. This is cognitive neuroscience telling you that people vote morals and values, not a laundry list of facts. So this idea that if we just tell people the facts, they will reason to the correct policy conclusion is completely false. We need to impact people in terms of values and provide moral leadership. And then the idea of a hero narrative can be effective, but that narrative must be told in the progressive frame. You can tell a very moving story and really tug at the heartstrings, but you can evoke conservative ideas through conservative language and reinforce the conservative frame, which we'll get to in a little bit. So what does cognitive science tell us about policy and politics, how we think, and why that's important? And I promise this won't get too wonkish. It's very understandable. So the question is, what are frames? We hear this all the time, talk about framing, talk about values-based messaging. What does this mean? Framing is the most easy thing you do all the time. It's thinking. So if I say restaurant, each one of you now has a different image and unconscious thought, even emotions, about restaurants going through your mind. And all the different roles, semantic roles that happen in a restaurant, such as waiter, food, dinner, chef, cooking, fork, knife, spoon, whatever it is. That's activating what's called a frame. And it's unconscious. They are neural circuits in our brains that evoke each other when the frame is activated. So it's physical. It's physical in your brain. It has to be that way. We evolved that way. And therefore, every message in politics is understood unconsciously in the context of a frame. So since framing is thinking, there's some important things about thought. And one of them is that Descartes was wrong. So what I learned at the University of Wisconsin, and many of you learned who went to college and studied, I learned that I think, therefore I am. The idea of enlightenment reason, thought is rational. Ideas and language can fit the world uniformly and directly. We now know that is 100% false. That thought requires emotion. That the smallest decision that you make during the day is wrought with emotional thought. And that, in fact, people who lose the capacity to process emotion through a stroke or some other type of accident have no capacity to make a decision. So emotion is critical to thought and decision making. The use of frames in terms of thinking, and emotion for that matter, is 98% unconscious. So you are only consciously aware of 2% of what you think, which is a stunning number. We like to think that we're these rational beings who go around and weigh the pros and cons and make rational decisions with great conscious thought. That's not the case. 98% of our activity is unconscious. Critically important. So there's new research that is demonstrating how your unconscious influences physical action and behavior. And this is fascinating stuff. As I said, your unconscious thought changes what you experience and what you understand about the world. It changes it to fit your previous existing knowledge. And prior to thought becoming conscious, your unconscious changes it to fit those systems and existing knowledge. So, for example, if you were in a cognition experiment and you were in a dark room, and this is all done in super slow motion for the purposes of this presentation, you would first be shown this empty circle, just for milliseconds. Then a few milliseconds later, this red circle would appear on the screen. And then you're asked, what did you perceive? And here's what people, you may be able to guess what people perceive. It's this. Even though they were presented with two distinct images at two different times. Now, what's important about this? Your brain unconsciously uses existing information to fill knowledge gaps. So your brain sensed unconsciously a knowledge gap in the center of that circle, the empty space in the center of the circle. Your brain goes back in time to the strongest available circuit to fill that gap, and it will fill in gaps of knowledge with existing knowledge. Now, what's important about that is that, as we'll see, the conservative frame, conservative ideas are dominant today. It is the strongest available circuit. So that means that for people who have missing information about anything, their brain will go back and reinforce that conservative circuit to fill those knowledge gaps, again, without conscious thought. This is pretty critical stuff. Here are two examples of reinforcing through negation. So the first one, Scott Walker has not even created half of the 250,000 jobs his central campaign promise depended on. Negation is the practice of trying to negate or present the opposing view through facts and just saying, no, that did not happen. For example, Richard Nixon saying, I'm not a crook. Everybody understood him as a crook. And the importance of that is that the message on the left from the DPW website raises and reinforces the conservative frame of economics in terms of job creation. We'll get to that in more detail in a minute. And by the end of this, you'll understand why that reinforces the conservative frame. So how is framing critical? As I said, every message has a frame. It defines your moral worldview. And people vote and respond on morals and values. And from research, we know that people vote on moral frames over issues every time. You probably have experienced this a lot in the last decade. Here's some very very astute examples of how powerful framing is. Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, very progressive ideas, very nurturant ideas, and he talks about we need to share responsibility, as he says there. It's easy to say it's not my fault, not my community, not my world, not my problem, and that the people who see the need and respond by sharing responsibility are my heroes. That is a tremendously progressive view and evocative of the progressive frame. The statement on the right there is from James Dobson, Focus on the Family, and this perfectly outlines the conservative view of the relationship between men and women. My observation is that women are merely waiting for their husbands to assume leadership. That says it in a nutshell. And we'll get to the specifics very soon. So what do conservatives know that makes them so successful? First of all, they know frames are necessary because everything is understood in the context of a frame. They know how to communicate outside of issue silos. Virtually every conservative issue can go back to two basic principles: small government and personal liberty. We don't have that as progressives. We have issue silos. If the facts don't reflect the frame a person believes, they reject the facts and keep the frame. That is 100% true. Facts require context in order to be understood for the reasons I mentioned earlier about how your unconscious changes thought before it becomes conscious. People are looking for a moral connection. We all know this. We've all experienced it. And most importantly, repetition is what embeds frames into the brain. So think of a frame as a road. The conservative frame is Interstate 39. It's very well traveled. It's been used a lot in public discourse. Therefore, it's repeated all the time, and it continues to reinforce it and embed it into people's brains and unconscious. The progressive frame at this moment in time is like Rural Route 22. It is very rough. It's not traveled very much. It's slow. And we need to start putting some work into those rural routes to make them into interstates through effective framing. So this is a perfect example of framing in a statement by Scott Walker. You're going to see a lot from him because he is very effective at framing, and he is in fact become the physical embodiment of the conservative frame, which by the end of this you'll get that. If you look at the red highlights there, you see the value statements moving forward, creating a metaphor for forward motion with his policies, helping people keep more of their paychecks This is the self-reliance that's found in the conservative frame. Tax relief is a metaphor for relieving the unjust burden that taxes is on your pursuit of personal wealth. Learn more to earn more is very recent. It's actually a metaphor for the conservative frame of education. And we'll see more of that a little later, but the conservative frame of education says children go to school to get a job. Period. So learn more to earn more evokes that metaphor relating to the conservative frame. And then this is the foundational statement of the conservative frame is that we have to move people from government dependence to true independence through work. So, there we go. So frames define common sense. This is really important because just like that interstate highway is well traveled, in public discourse, that interstate highway defines what common sense is because it's the most often used ideas, vision, and language in public discourse. And we're going to see that in practice tonight. And once you get done with this, I guarantee you will never watch a newscast or ever listen to a statement by a politician again the same way. You will understand it very differently in terms of what is being evoked as common sense. The other thing that's important about that is that when you activate one frame, you inhibit activating the opposite frame. And that's a thing called mutual inhibition. We do it all the time, unconsciously. I can't, for example, I have my yummy glass of water here. All sorts of things happen during that action that involves mutual inhibition of one set of muscles and an opposing set of muscles, and drinking and not breathing as I drink. And it all happens unconsciously in a split second. And the same thing is true in terms of language and cognition. When you activate one, you exercise it, you strengthen it, and you inhibit the other. Here's a few examples of common sense being redefined. And you're probably going to understand this at a very, very emotional level. That earned retirement benefits, known as pensions, are now thought of as entitlements. Negotiating for a fair living wage portion of profit, we'll get to that in detail later, is now thought of as collective bargaining. And that evokes the conservative frame for reasons we'll see a little later. Citizens caring for each other through social programs is thought of as big government. And defunding and destroying quality free public education for every child is thought of as education reform or school choice. Very, very stark differences between those ideas and having them be changed through redefining common sense. So we're going to take a look at the differing views of democracy based on these metaphorical moral systems. And you see the pictures there outlined perfectly. You have the protesters at the Capitol represent one metaphorical system, and then of course the Scott Walker supporters with the signs that say "Believe in Wisconsin Again" represent the polar opposite moral system. So frames define your moral worldview. And again, we talk about these in terms of metaphorical because they are based on how we all very unconsciously understand familial structures. The progressive frame is based on this idea of the nurturant parent family, and the conservative frame is based on the strict father family. Again, think of the difference between Mr. Rogers and James Dobson, focus on the family, very conservative religious ideology. So let's start with the progressive democracy, based on the idea of the nurturing parent. The primary value that you should all come away with tonight is this idea of empathy. And when we're talking about empathy in terms of moral frames and moral worldview, we're talking about empathy as the responsibility to care for oneself and others equally. So you have a responsibility to be your brother's keeper. Think of FDR and the New Deal. Very empathetic, talking about how government walks with people on the side of the Good Samaritan to care for each other. And that is the foundational idea in the progressive frame of empathy. And authority in the progressive idea of democracy is gained through an ethic of excellence. We want our progressive leaders to be who they say they are and how they act. And they act on their empathy, they take responsibility, our best and brightest. Those are the people who we want in authority. And very basically, democracy is this fundamental idea of caring citizens acting responsibly for each other. Right? So we have empathy, and because of the empathy, we have a responsibility to care for others, which we do by acting through the public, the government. Very important that we start saying that because it's getting lost these days. So I hear a lot of this, we've lost the idea of freedom, the conservatives are dominating freedom, and that may be true. But freedom is still a contested value because people fundamentally understand what progressive freedom means. They may not necessarily express it well or be able to verbalize it, but they feel it, and we need to start making that conscious. So here are some ideas of progressive freedom. First of all, people, that's all of us, act through government, which again, government is all of us, ideally, to provide public resources to maximize freedom. Therefore, private life and private enterprise are not possible without the public. We're going to talk about a multitude of examples of this. And I have a video coming up shortly that's going to show that. Therefore, freedom, fundamentally, is not possible without the public. Just let that sink in for a minute. And when's the last time you heard a politician say that? That freedom is not possible without the public. Critically important. So here's the first video, which I'll pull up here. I looked for other examples of this. This is the best one I found. So this is Elizabeth Warren, and she's going to tell you what freedom in the progressive frame means.
All this, well, this is class warfare, this is whatever. No, there is nobody in this country who got rich on his own. Nobody. You built a factory out there, good for you, but I want to be clear, you moved your goods to market on the roads the rest of us paid for. You hired workers, the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for. You didn't have to worry that marauding bands would come and seize everything at your factory and hire someone to protect against this because of the work the rest of us did. Now look, you built a factory and it turned into something terrific or a great idea. God bless. Keep a big hunk of it. But part of the underlying social contract is you take a hunk of that and pay forward for the next kid who comes.